The Role of Dopamine in the Brain
by Sydni Neal, Kelsey Klein,
and Inselmann.
Dopamine plays an important part for many different functions within the brain.
Dopamine is a type of neurotransmitter that is responsible for pleasure and excitement.
Many people and animals seek out experiences that increase their dopamine in order to feel good. This is often why individuals become addicted to drugs such as cocaine or amphetamine. These drugs affect dopamine by either increasing the output of dopamine, prolonging the release of dopamine, slowing down the reuptake of dopamine, or all of the above.
Dopamine neurons are located in the ventro-anterior midbrain. Midbrain dopamine activates in phases following rewarding stimuli. About 55 to 75% of dopamine neurons are activated by conditioned visual and auditory stimuli.
Wow, that's awesome!
Releases usually occur close to behavioral reactions. However, primary rewards are more effective than conditioned stimuli in terms of magnitude. Dopamine neurons do not distinguish between auditory or visual modalities for reward predicting stimuli.
Wow, that's super interesting. Please tell me more.
Well, even though dopamine doesn't distinguish between the two modalities for reward predicting stimuli, they do discriminate between neutral stimuli and rewarding stimuli. Have activation depression responses to stimuli that are not rewarding.
Besides rewarding stimuli, what else does dopamine have an effect on?
I'm glad you asked. Dopamine activation actually goes through changes when someone is learning. Primary rewards elicit neuronal activations during learning. During the learning period, both conditioned stimuli and rewards can elicit an activation. After learning, the activations switch between reward-predicting stimuli and unpredicted rewards.
Are there any differences?
Yes, actually. One very big difference between learning and a fully acquired behavior is the degree of reward's unpredictability. The criterion for a reward to be unpredictable is the time of the reward. Dopamine neurons are depressed at the time of the typical occurrence of the reward. Even if there is an absence of the stimuli, dopamine can still be depressed.
Wow, that's super interesting.
Not only does dopamine contribute to rewards, it also has some downsides. Dopamine can also play a part in human addictions as well. Human addictions are relapsing disorders with drugs or alcohol. The development of addiction impacts many different neurobiological processes. If there are any changes in signals to neurotransmitters, in this case dopamine, it can mess with the reward circuit, which could potentially lead to the vulnerability of relapse.
Wow, that's scary. Can you explain more?
Well, during withdrawal, there is a decrease in extracellular dopamine, which shows a decrease in spontaneous firing rates and patterns in the neurons of the mesolimbic dopamine system. These changes increase sensitivity to opioid receptor antagonists.
Wow, that's interesting.
Psychostimulants, like cocaine for example, increase extracellular dopamine by inhibiting reuptake of dopamine. Opiates also increase dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens.
Now that's super interesting.
Isn't totally evil though, right?
Dopamine is not bad at all, actually. A healthy level of dopamine is required in order to maintain mental health. This is most common in the case of depression.
How so?
Well, a growing collection of evidence shows that dopamine plays a key role in major depressive disorder and can cause issues in two ways. First, major depressive disorder may result in an issue with dopamine production. Research shows that some individuals with major depressive disorder are not producing enough dopamine at regular intervals.
What's the other way?
The other way major depressive disorder may result from issues of dopamine is when there are impaired signal transduction. Impaired signal transduction may result from either changes in receptor numbers, areas of the brain responsible for recognizing that dopamine is present, and/or from altered intracellular signal processing. Major depressive disorder may also result from receptors within the brain uptaking dopamine too quickly.
Wow, that sounds complicated.
You're right, it is a little technical, but it's important for understanding the overall role of dopamine.
How do individuals suffering from major depressive disorder get better then?
Individuals rely on antidepressants to help regulate the amount of uptake of dopamine. However, antidepressants do not directly enhance the transmitters themselves. Therefore, they may cause residual side effects such as a lack of concentration, motivation, and/or pleasure. These antidepressants aim to slow the reuptake of dopamine, allowing the receptors more time to recognize and utilize dopamine.
Does having dopamine issues affect everyday life?
Well, for instance, with people who suffer from major depressive disorder, having less dopamine within their system means that they often do not seek out rewards in the same ways people with healthy levels of dopamine do.
Sounds interesting. Can you explain more?
Sure. When studying rats with a reduced concentration of dopamine, they found that these rats were less likely to complete rewarding behaviors or to work towards rewards in general.
What does this mean for humans?
Well, as of current research, the heritability of major depression is estimated to be anywhere from 31 to 42%. Therefore, the chances of passing major depressive disorder down through family lines is relatively high. This is because issues with dopamine production and uptake can be passed down through genes.
That explains why it's important to know your family history of mental health problems.
Exactly. Plays a major role in other mental illnesses as well, though.
Like what?
Like schizophrenia, for example. Schizophrenia is a mental illness most often characterized by disturbances of thoughts, perceptions, volition, and cognition. It most commonly becomes apparent in an individual during late adolescence, and the symptoms often present in cycles with periods of seeming remission in between.
So, how does dopamine affect schizophrenia?
According to previous research, it seems as though there is a direct relationship between D2 receptors responsible for the uptake of dopamine and dopamine itself. Studies suggest that these D2 receptors are not uptaking dopamine quickly enough, and therefore dopamine is not being utilized by the brain correctly. According to a study, individuals with schizophrenia were treated by increasing the amount of D2 receptors in order to uptake dopamine correctly. Within their study, they found that having more D2 receptors increased the uptake of dopamine within individuals with schizophrenia and therefore allowed for more regulation of their positive symptoms.
What are positive symptoms?
Positive symptoms for schizophrenia include hearing voices, hallucinations, delusions, and/or racing thoughts. Patients who underwent treatment saw a decrease in these positive symptoms. The negative symptoms, which include apathy, reduced social drive, and a loss of motivation, did not see any significant change. While this may seem like bad news in terms of treatment for schizophrenia, having a reduction of positive symptoms can go a long way for those suffering from such issues.
Did you know dopamine actually plays a super important role when it comes to reproduction too? Dopamine is the feel-good or love hormone with amazing effects. high attention, improved short-term memory, boldness, and a temporary desire to explore the world and take risks. This is the hormone that when you leave the presence of a loved one, that you leave feeling happy. The same mechanism that we have discussed of dopamine regarding drug use may be applicable to love also. When we are in love with someone, we experience pleasant and satisfying emotions. These emotions immediately produce a release of dopamine in the brain, so the emotion gives us the feeling of pleasure.
So love is a drug?
That is one way to see it. To put it another way, when we kiss our partner and perform a behavior that allows us to express the emotions of love, dopamine is triggered in our brain. If dopamine was not released, we would probably never stay in a relationship with anyone. The increase of this substance in the brain regions is the main factor that motivates the appearance of feelings of pleasure in these moments. So it acts as a mental mechanism that indicates that what we are doing is something we like.
Same way drugs and dopamine work together, does that mean you can literally be addicted to love?
Yes, it does. The individual's brain knows that when he or she is with their partner, they will release greater amounts of dopamine, so they will look for such situations to experience pleasure. This way, love can motivate the search for this emotion and desire to be with the loved one in the same way that a drug can help the addict continue to consume. This comparison may be a bit extreme since obviously the changes produced by drugs and dopamine in the brain can be different from those produced by the feelings of love. However, they serve as an example of how these types of feelings are experienced thanks to the production of chemical modifications in the brain. Therefore, dopamine can explain the emotions of love in humans. To give a more clear example, the dopamine released during an orgasm is equal in effect to one shot of heroin, as some scientists have claimed.
Addiction.
Absolutely. One study found that when participants simply looked at a picture of people they were romantically involved with, the areas in which were enriched with dopamine were the ones being triggered.
You get a dose of happiness just by looking at a picture of my boyfriend?
According to researchers, yes, you can. Only a small amount, but it definitely will make you feel better. Thus, the feelings of pleasure we discussed earlier might explain part of the need for a person in love to see the person they are in love with.
It sounds like dopamine plays an important role in a lot of different areas of life, from basic functions to serious mental conditions.
You're completely right. That's why it's so important to understand how dopamine works, as well as what can happen if your brain isn't producing dopamine correctly.
In review, dopamine can affect areas of the brain that are used for both reward and learning. Without dopamine, many of the daily functions we perform would be much more difficult, and in some cases, they wouldn't even happen at all. Another interesting fact about dopamine is that it is a product of social media as well. Every time we receive a like or notification from a post, we get a little jolt of dopamine because we are being rewarded.
That's right. In addition to that, healthy levels and uses of dopamine are needed in order to maintain mental health. Without it, mental illnesses such as major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, and many more become prevalent for the individual. Living with mental illnesses can be very serious and very difficult. This is why it is so important to study areas of the brain that are involved in dopamine.
Additionally, dopamine is necessary for the function of love and relationships between humans. Without dopamine, the act of falling in love or even feeling love would be much more difficult. Relationships, therefore, would be much less rewarding and individuals would be less likely to remain in them. While dopamine is not the only hormone that is important for relationships, it does go a long way in the brain for individuals who are in or seeking relationships.
If you're interested in learning more about the functions of the brain and humans in general, it is important to understand the functions of dopamine and how it plays a role in our everyday life.
While the science may be intimidating and technical, there is a lot that can be learned from dopamine.
I agree. The best things that can be learned come from putting yourself out there and doing your best. Hey, you might even get some dopamine out of the whole process too. Thanks for watching!